All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. If we haven't met before, my name's Scott. I am part of our team here at Commons. This is Meg, who's joined us tonight. I'll introduce her more in a second. But I wanted to start as we're getting going and as you are joining us for tonight's conversation. Just wanted to start with a couple of details about our ongoing parenting course. The first is that as we've been letting you know all the way along, we've created a landing page for all of the course content. That goes for the videos and the recordings that sort of go up after the fact. But then we are each week adding resources throughout the week. Some of them are sourced from our lovely practitioners. They give us some tools, and I think we'll probably have some of that head your way after tonight's conversation. But just want you to make sure that you're checking out that space and taking advantage of the tools that we're putting there. And then the second note that I'll make just as we get going is that, of course, again, we invite you to put your questions that might pop up for you if you hear something being said and you want to hear a little bit more clarity or a bit more exploration. Just throw that in the chat. I'm sitting here sort of trying to pay attention to that. One of the things I've appreciated over the past few weeks is that some of you have been jumping in with your comments and your observations and sort of chiming in. And I'll try to pull those in to our conversation as we move along again tonight. Tonight is a really important conversation. I'm super excited.
Yeah, me too.
Meg and I have been talking about for a few weeks now.
We have.
Thinking about our children and their sexuality. Our children are sexual beings, and we need to maybe talk a little bit about what that means for us as parents, because this can feel like a really big topic. So let me introduce, this is Meg Lindemulder. You have a practice here in the city of Calgary called Curio Counseling.
Correct.
Maybe before you jump into sort of what you're going to lead us through in conversation, you could give us a sense of what Curio is like, maybe how long that practice has been going.
Yeah.
And then maybe tell us about your expertise as a parent, or little family life, if you would like to. Go right ahead. Welcome here.
Thanks. I'm Meg. I own Curio Counseling here in Calgary. It's been open for about a year and a half now. And it's been an adventure doing all of that kind of own business kind of thing and trying to get all that going. But been a really cool experience. Hard when you're also trying to just like, your passion is on, I want to, work with people, but I've got to put something on Instagram. Like, it's hard, but we make it work. And like you said, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, and 2 of them officially diagnosed as neurodivergent. The 3rd one I'm pretty sure is going to follow suit. So there's definitely challenges there, but they're amazing, and it's just this wonderful roller coaster adventure that parenting is. Of course. Prior to being a therapist, I was a teacher for 10 years, mostly taught high school. So for those of you who have little kids, hopefully I can speak from more of my parenting experience. Those of you who have kids more in high school, I'll be teaching maybe a little bit more from my teacher and counseling experience. Yeah.
Nice. I like that you bring, there's a bigger tool belt. Like you've sort of approached and lived in the world with maybe multiple expertise. And this is going to be, education is, teachers are at front lines.
Oh, they absolutely are.
We work, as parents, these are the people we work hand in hand with in forming our kids. And I think we actually talked about it last week a little bit about how those relationships are so important to build sort of, how do we become allies with our teachers who are dealing with our kids on their phones in the classroom? We think it's hard at home.
No kidding.
Imagine dealing with it at school. So anyways.
I dealt with it 10 years ago, so I can only imagine.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, why don't we jump in?
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
You've got all the answers, right?
No, I do not.
Okay.
But I have some ideas and maybe some guidelines that can be helpful to parents. So, the topic tonight is your child and their sexuality. And I think we had talked about, like, there might be this sort of temptation to jump right away to, are we talking just about, like, queerness? Are we talking just about how we, kids or people in general, navigate their sexuality when it's maybe different than a lot of other people's? But in our conversations and in thinking about it, sexuality is a part of all of our lives, and it begins in the womb. I mean, kids come out of sex. So like it's just, we are sexual beings. And I think it maybe is more beneficial to talk about what that means for us as parents and how we help our children understand themselves as sexual beings, and how do we responsibly teach them to live as sexual beings in the world. Yeah. So.
Great place to start from.
Okay, great.
Great assumption there.
Yeah,
I love it.
I hope so. So I thought maybe we could just start by kind of talking about what sexuality actually is. I know for a lot of people it's like, well, it's just about sex, but it's actually so much more than that. You know, it's about how we understand our bodies and how we understand our relationships and how our bodies are in relationships, how we use our bodies in relationships. It's connected to our values and beliefs, which we're going to talk more about later. Our desires, gender, of course, is part of it. Gender expression is part of it. And then the way we think and feel about all of these things, right? Like, and then even just our bodies, like, what does our body look like and how do we relate to it? Sexuality is unique to each person, even though it's something we all have and embrace. And it's probably going to change. It's a dynamic thing, right? I think another thing too is that maybe we need to try and create more space to allow our children to define their own sexuality while giving them guidelines and parameters and helping them do that in a healthy way. Rather than prescribing what it should look like, which is maybe what the church has tended to do in the past. Not that it was all bad, but overall, I think it's just important to remember that if we want to raise healthy, happy kids, we have to talk about their sexuality and we have to help them understand their sexuality. Yeah.
To work from this assumption that we can't delay their exploration or their encounter with their own sexuality.
Yeah.
And that we actually need to maybe try to be ahead of that. Sort of
Yes.
like, basically assume that they're asking questions about their body, exploring,
Absolutely.
right? Like I wonder, that's maybe not something that all parents make that assumption. So just to
No.
sort of encourage us to all be a bit more open in this.
Yeah.
To be ahead.
Absolutely. And to normalize it, right? And to, like, I can't speak for everybody out there, but I know, like, my growing up, my parents did a pretty good job of teaching, like, basics, you know, the basic physical parts of anatomy and, like, what sex is. But the other parts of it, maybe we just didn't really talk about because it was just assumed you're not going to have sex till you get married, so we don't need to go there right now. But that left like a lot of gaps in my understanding of myself as a sexual person, and even just in terms of making responsible decisions later in life. And so I think normalizing it for our kids and being open and talking about it can be really helpful. But I know that's not easy, so.
I mean, that's why we're talking
here.
about it.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, a conversation like this makes it a little bit easier, and also gives us some handles.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah,
I really do. Yeah. So one of the things that I don't know, maybe that looks bad on the camera. Sorry, everyone. One of the things that I wanted to kind of start with in terms of how do we do this? How do we talk to our kids about sexuality and help them understand themselves as sexual beings? And that, I think, starts with kind of what's maybe been already talked about in the previous weeks, is that we have to do our own work around it as well. You know, so much of parenting is doing what we need to do to show up for our kids, right? And doing our own work. Because really, before we can manage our parenting around our children's sexuality, we have to understand our own sexuality. And we have to understand our own thoughts and feelings around that. And that can be really nuanced and complicated, especially if we grew up kind of being taught or maybe just assuming that it's not something you think or talk about, right? And so one way to kind of do this is to be intentional about creating a personal sexual ethic. And so what I mean by that is this idea of creating a collection of values that will guide you in your relationships, in your sexuality, how you express your sexuality, your connection to your body, those kinds of things. And really understanding what our beliefs and values are around sexuality.
Can I just pause you?
Absolutely.
So you're saying that we as adults, as parents, we need to create our own. And can you just go over you just listed like 3 or 4 things
Yeah.
there that
Yeah.
we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just what were those
I'll
things?
expand
Like,
on some of
okay, you're
those.
going to build
Yeah,
on.
I'll
Okay,
build
great.
on that.
I was like,
Absolutely.
I didn't have a chance to
No,
write them down.
sorry, I kind of jumped into that. Sorry.
That's good. No, it's good.
So creating a sexual ethic, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do this. If you feel stuck or you don't like kind of, the suggestions that I make today, Google it, honestly. There's all kinds of great information on the internet. But these are sort of some steps that you can take to build a sexual ethic. So the first one is to identify your own values and beliefs. And I mean that kind of in a general sense, not just around sex and sexuality, although that would be part of it, obviously. And that can take time. It can take time to untangle from what we were taught, from what we've gone through, from our experiences, how our worldview maybe has shifted. There's a lot of different things to look at when we're trying to identify our values and beliefs. Some people struggle with this or have never actually done the work of what are my core values. And surprise, a therapist can probably help you figure that out. But honestly, you can do, or you can, again, Google, we love Google. You can do a values finding exercise and see what, or talk to somebody who has experience with understanding how to narrow down our values or to identify those core values. And then they can become foundational for really how we do all our parenting and how we navigate the world in general as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The second thing, kind of the second step in creating a sexual ethic is to reflect on your own experiences. Sexual experiences, but also just relational experiences with your own body, and really trying to understand what those experiences have taught you about yourself, about your own sexuality. It's not necessarily creating a checklist of all the different experiences or encounters you've had, but it's more about trying to find patterns or through lines that make sense for you in terms of maybe what you do know you like in terms of sexual expression or engaging in sexual activity, or what you don't like. Even thinking about focusing on how you feel or how you felt in those situations. Did you feel safe? Did you feel cared for? Did you feel like you were being taken advantage of? And then how does that inform your building of a sexual ethic that works for you now? Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Part of this is dealing with your own upbringing. What were you taught about sex and sexuality? Did it work? Did it not work? Maybe some of it was good, some of it not as good. Were there gaps? Was there too much information at inappropriate ages? All these different things that you can kind of start sifting through to figure out if that fits.
Yeah, I think this is super helpful, especially for people who have, if as a parent, if you were raised around religious communities, chances are you haven't probably done this work deliberately or been encouraged to. And by that, I mean on both sides of the spectrum, where you've been encouraged to think about and reflect on your experiences, your earliest awareness of your sexuality, and being honest about that, trying to think about when that emerged. And I think the language used, think sensory, think how did I feel, what kind of power relationships were there in those experiences, and not because they were wrong, but because we need to think about it and process, because there's no way to interact with our children about their sexuality without having done this work. And I think historically, religious communities haven't done a great job of encouraging people to be whole beings in this way. And this is one of the many ways we can encourage each other. Towards maturity and growth, and becoming whole. This is ever and always. We're an organization that says that isn't that what sort of the divine comes to us and does? It invites us into a journey of wholeness.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so I really appreciate the language, especially for those who maybe. Actually, I'm just thinking. But if you grew up in an a-religious environment, you may have had the same same
Yeah.
experience where there were no, there was no sacred imagination for the
No.
world. And
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean that you got better training or better
No,
language at
not
all.
necessarily. Exactly. Yeah. I think connected to that too is like if you grew up in a religious community, chances are you either encountered or heard about the whole purity culture idea, but a lot of that then ends up coming with feelings of guilt and shame and repressing our sexuality and pretending we're not sexual beings until we say I do, and then magically we get to be sexual beings, but we don't really know how to do that. And we've never been taught how to do it. And sometimes you can learn that together, and that can be an amazing thing, but there can be a lot of damage that's kind of embedded in that as well, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But, really trying to deal with some of that stuff that might be lingering, or different things that you've internalized. A little later, we'll talk about how do we talk to our kids about sex and sexuality. And one of the things is doing your own work first, but also like trying to manage any guilt or shame you might feel around it that will make you uncomfortable in those conversations. Because kids are really intuitive and they'll pick up on that real fast. And then they'll start to think like, oh, this is maybe a taboo subject or something that mom doesn't want to talk about or dad doesn't feel comfortable sharing, and that can close doors, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I no lie, was telling my kids that I was coming to sort of participate in this conversation, and was asked, like, are you going to be talking about us? And I said, no. But this is what you just referenced, I would say has been my steepest growing curve. So I just want to be honest about it's been as my children, as people in the world, as they've emerged as sexual beings, when I realize I'm uncomfortable, there's an invitation in that to sort of like, well, why is that?
Yeah.
Especially when you've done a good job as a parent to create an environment where your children feel safe and they feel as though they can explore and they feel as though they can encounter the world as a sexual being. And I mean, isn't that what we want for our kids?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But then to have that out in the world, then, at least as a parent, I've had a few moments where I'm more aware of, I don't know why this makes me uncomfortable or why I feel that I need to react.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, that our kids are intuitive. And so, I mean, again, there's just a steady invitation in this.
Yes.
For anybody else who's felt like they've maybe dropped the ball or felt like, I didn't do the work ahead of time, have I messed it up? No. I think actually, let's just come back to it. And that's why this exercise of like forming an ethic, thinking clearly about what do I actually think, it's a great place to start.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was actually just going to say piggybacking to what you just said is that like this is an ongoing process. Like you might think you figured it all out and then your kid comes up with something and you're like, oh, that's bringing up something. I don't know what that is. But yeah, instead of trying to shut that down or brush it off, like, yeah, let's get curious about it. Let's figure out why do I feel uncomfortable with this? And then, as our kids get older, even being honest about that and saying like, I kind of feel uncomfortable with this right now. I'm not really sure what's going on, but I want to figure it out, because that invites them to do the same. Yeah.
And that's actually pretty normal.
It is very normal.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, absolutely. I'll probably repeat that later. Okay. Oh, actually, there's one other thing I wanted to put into there. As you reflect on your experiences, it will bring things up probably. And if that's something you're not able or willing to do alone, then find a safe space to do that, whether it's a partner or a therapist or a pastor or whatever, but finding a safe place to do that. And then really listening to yourself and your body as you process, I think is super important. I'm thinking back to some of the grounding techniques and the anxiety stuff that Trina talked about in week 1, and how, some of those things, when we notice what's happening in our body as we start to feel uncomfortable, like pay attention to that, because if you need a break, you need a break.
And this would be especially true in our discussions of our sexuality,
Yes.
I would think, because of the deeply integrated nature
Absolutely.
of psychosomatic, the marrying of our brains with our bodily experience, how that ties to memory. So I think, thank you for your care in this, to encourage us to be careful and gracious with ourselves as we, as we encounter all of the diverse experiences through our children's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings up a lot of our own stuff, right? For sure. Yeah. The next piece of creating your own sexual ethic is to like consider other people's values, beliefs, and experiences as well. So have conversations with other people. Invite other people from all walks of life, if able to, if you have that kind of relationship, to ask like, what is your sexual ethic? Or have you done that work? Or, you know, what's important to you around this? Or, and just trying to understand a diverse range of the way different people experience their sexuality, how they feel about it, how they express it. I think this does a couple of things for us. As parents, it opens us up to maybe more acceptance or less judgment if our kids start exploring areas of their sexuality that we're not really sure we are okay with or we're not comfortable with or whatever. But if we've, you know, done the work ahead of time to understand people who maybe are in that community, whether it's, you know, a queer community or even, you know, like polyamory or things like this, like, is this something that you could be okay with if that's a path your child chooses?
Or I was going to say, even going the opposite way on the spectrum, we live in a world where we are going to increasingly interact with people. Our children will go to school with other children from cultures that are very conservative around human sexuality. And knowing and understanding how other cultures view the human body, that's going to probably give us some tools or some elasticity in our language to be careful and invite. And then also to be, I just think about in my parenting relationship, to be careful in the language that I choose with my kids, just to be sensitive, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was actually, when you said go the other way, my brain went somewhere else, but I was thinking about like even like, you know, people who identify as asexual or, you know, they're not sexual, like they're still sexual beings. It's just that they express it differently, right? And it shows up in their lives differently. And so I think the more that we can, you know, understand and encourage other people's perspectives around sexuality to inform our own sexual ethic, not only helps us in creating what is important to us, but also helps us in our parenting, I think. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, here's maybe the hardest part of all of it is now you have to actually write it down.
Okay.
And I say this deliberately because I don't think it's enough to just think about it and do the work. And now maybe writing down isn't your thing. Maybe you want to do like a little voice memo or whatever, or just have a conversation with a partner or something, but really be able to articulate what your sexual ethic is and understand it, right? So what's important to you about that, but doing it in a very deliberate, purposeful way, not just, oh yeah, I've thought about it and I kind of know what it is, but it's almost like creating like, you know, this kind of foundational document or framework that you can come back to in your own understanding of your sexuality, as your experiences change, as your kids start, you know, go through these different stages of their own sexuality. It can become something that we come back to. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm over here writing notes.
Yeah,
so,
I love it.
That's great.
You know, and talk about it and share it and see if it needs to shift, you know, or see if, and that's really the last kind of step in this is to, actually that's not the last step, I lied. But I'm going to say, I'm going to jump down to the last one, if you can see it on your slide, to assessing and adjusting it as well, in terms of, you know, as things come up or as our experiences change, maybe there will be something we need to shift or change in our sexual ethic. You know, ideally, foundationally, the core of it doesn't change no matter what relationship we're talking about. But sometimes our perspective shifts, right? And so being open, like treating it as more of a living document, not something that has to stay etched in stone kind of thing. And then back to the the previous point, which is to release judgment. And I think this one maybe is, I said that writing it down was the most difficult, but maybe this one's the most difficult in that it's not just judgment of others, but judgment of ourselves. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but just that feeling of like, what kind of, if I create a sexual ethic for myself that maybe is in stark contrast to what I was taught as a child, or in stark contrast to what I believed 5 years ago, or 10, or whatever, or in stark contrast to how I behaved sexually in the past, can I release judgment? Can I refrain from judging myself for whatever comes up as a result of that? I think that can be really a really difficult process in terms of like what kind of guilt and shame have we possibly internalized as a result of that, and how do we work through that? And again, maybe professional help is what you need with that, but just really trying to come to a place where you can look at an articulated sexual ethic after you've done all this work and recognize, you know what, this is, I'm good with this. This is where I'm at right now. And a lot of different things have brought me here, but I'm trying to let go of, those voices in our head that come from the past or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what came to mind for me is that I think any kind of change in our life and in our sexual ethic over time, this is where we're going to have to do this work of sort of surrendering judgment. So, and I think regardless of which way you're moving on a scale, if you've gone from a place of like great restraint in your sexual ethic to one of more freedom and exploration, you're going to need to do some work on, forgiving those who may have shaped you, or not judging those who, right? The same could also be true if you have the opposite experience.
Absolutely.
Maybe you were quite free and exploratory, and that was good for you, but then you came to a place where you thought, actually I want to make choices that are going to be defined by different values than those that were shaping that freedom. And now I have to sort of reconcile myself to the person that I was, or to the people that I partnered with, there's a million ways that, I think it's so important to name this, that it's in the changing, or it's in our growing understanding, our discernment, our maturing, that basically it doesn't matter how you're maturing, you're going to have to do this work of releasing judgment. So.
Yeah. I really appreciate you identifying that, like that can go from either way, as it
100%.
shifts, absolutely. And then of course, connected to that is releasing judgment of other people. Other people are going to have different sexual ethic than you. Like I started off with talking about, like, sexuality is a very personal thing. And, being okay with other people having a different sexual ethic than you, that becomes a different conversation if there are people you want to partner with or explore, sexual activities with. That becomes a different conversation where maybe your ethics do need to be more aligned, but also recognizing that people come to these understandings about their sexuality and the way they choose to express it and act on it in their own ways, right? And we don't get to decide whether that's good or bad or right or wrong.
Isn't that the challenge with parenting?
Well, absolutely.
Right? Like, in that, I think, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Like, I think that's actually maybe one of the primary challenges as our children mature. Like, and you're going to talk a little bit about, like, developmental cycles. Like, our children will change.
Yes.
And we're going to have to do this work. There's no choice.
No.
Yeah. I'm a parent in this moment as I think about that. Yeah.
Me too.
It's tricky.
I can sit here and talk about all these things. It doesn't mean I've done a great job of them either, right? Like, I learn and grow too, right? Even in preparing for this and the conversations that we had and the research and stuff that I was doing, like, there's things that have shifted for me just in the past few weeks that I'm like, okay, there's things I could do better. Right. And that's one thing, I will say this again, but I think it's important enough to bring it up now, is that it's never too late to start, and it's never too late to try to do it better. Even if your child is 18 and about to leave the house, doesn't mean you can't have these conversations. Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of the the sexual ethic piece in terms of like, how would you go about doing that? Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple questions about
Yeah,
that, but
let's do that.
No, let's come back to them.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, if anybody else has questions specifically about that dynamic piece, that's very deliberate. It's almost like a parenting practice. It's almost a spiritual practice, I would argue. If you haven't done this, if you haven't thought about it deliberately, and actually, let me just lean into it too.
Yeah,
As a pastor, if you find that the dominant narratives that shape your imagination of your own sexuality are rooted in some of how the scriptures have been framed, I think this is some of what's really helpful is to name. So when I think about my sexuality, I think about, I'm just pulling something out of my head, the Apostle Paul in one of his letters talking about it's better that you stay single, because again, the Apostle Paul has an apocalyptic imagination. He thinks the world's going to end next week, so he would prefer that everybody does the work of trying to let everybody know the story of Jesus than go into the work of getting married. And what's interesting to me is that Paul's imagination of the world and sexuality, that gets used to sort of like inform singleness. It also gets informed to define relationships, because in the same letters he would say things like, it's better that, get married so that you're not burning up with lust. Make sure you're sexually active if you can't keep yourself, right? Yeah. That language gets used to prescribe sexual activity for people who have a religious imagination in the Christian tradition. And then you have like alternative views. I'm just thinking about, there's this lovely passage in the book of Jeremiah where people are returning from exile or being encouraged to come back to settle in the city, to have children. And there's this lovely language around basically building homes around intimate relationships and being productive members of society, which embedded in that is this, I think, this beautiful picture of a fruitful sexual ethic for people. Like, be sexually active, be fruitful in the world. And I've never heard those passages used to like encourage people in their forming of a sexual ethic.
No, me neither.
But it's one of those things that I just think maybe we need to, if we're going to go through, make a list of the scriptural pieces that have been dominant and put them down. Also, one of the good things to do with this is make sure, go and find them. Find out if there are actually verses, because sometimes we have something that we think is scripture. It's not. It's just a truism or something that somebody said one time. Just be curious about those things and start there. I think it's lovely practice.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I think, what brings to mind as you're talking about that is like our sexuality and our spirituality are linked. Like they're intertwined. Like you can't really separate them if you really think about it. And if you want to start thinking about like, the intimacy that can be part of sex and, that sacredness and the spiritual aspect to that. Didn't like Rob Bell write a book about that? Like called Sex God or something? I don't know. I think
Somebody can chime in the chat. I am not up to date on my
Rob Bell library. About how sexuality and spirituality are inextricably linked and they're intertwined and we can't separate them necessarily, nor should we. Right. And yet we've sort of been told that we need to, unfortunately, until we get married and then it's all good. I have hang-ups, can you tell? That's my own work right there. Okay, so I wanted to also spend a little bit of time talking about developmental stages of sexuality, just so that, to kind of just help parents recognize what are normal things, what are normal sexual behaviors at different ages, and, also what are ways to encourage healthy sexuality at every age. So, we can kind of talk about infants, so birth to 2 to 3 years. Those first formative years in our lives. You may or may not have observed in your own children some of these things, but it's little kids, babies are curious about their bodies, their own and others. I mean, even little babies grabbing their feet, things like that, right? And remember, sexuality is about our whole body, not just our genitals. Like, it's about all of it. It's really normal for honestly, kids of all ages, but I will also just say to explore their body parts, to touch themselves, to notice that maybe feels nice, to just be curious about themselves. toddlers tend to be, or like really young, I'm skipping ahead, infants. But as they get older, if they able to talk, they'll talk openly about their bodies and their body functions. Like, I have to poop, or I pooped, or, you know, like they're very open about those kinds of things. There's no like stigma or shame around any of that kind of stuff. It's just they're very open about all of it. Usually they're able to understand the difference between male and female, and they begin to start empathizing with others near the end of that stage. And I think that's an important part when we talk about sexuality and development of that, because again, sexuality is more than just the act of sex. It's about how we are in relationship with other people as well. Yeah. So a couple things that you can do as a parent in this stage to, encourage healthy sexuality. One is like teaching proper body part names. And I think this is pretty well accepted practice now, but it hasn't been for that long, right? But, help children should know, like, this is a penis, not like a pee-pee or a wee-wee or whatever we used to call those things, but help give them proper names for their body parts. Be affectionate with them in physical ways, and encourage them to explore their bodies, and to explore other people's bodies, and to be curious about things, right? Like, I don't know, I'm sure every parent out here who's experienced, has a child who's 3 or older, has experienced something along the lines of like, whoa, what are those? Or what's that? Or daddy's penis is so much bigger than mine, or whatever. And to not shut that down, but to like just talk about it as normal and natural, right? Yeah.
They're observing the world,
Absolutely.
which is what they should do.
Yes.
I was just going to say, and then what's interesting is I think lots of us as parents have the experience of being around children, whether they're your own or somebody else's, a child who's doing that, and they're like stepping over like whatever social situation you're in. And I just think if my child was doing that when my mother was in the room, they're like, oh my gosh, I would have been quite embarrassed because of the generational gap, and also because I'm aware of maybe my parents or any other person in the room. I know maybe we don't have the same approach, and this is part of what, like, I don't know what developmental stage we're supposed to help our children how to understand. There are places where you're free to talk about that or refer to people's bodies, and then there comes a point in your life where it's not cute anymore, and we shouldn't be referring to or staring, or do you know what I'm saying? Like,
I know exactly what you're saying.
We end up doing this training, and chances are you've already done it as parents. You can't go back now.
No.
Right, and I think that's pretty normal.
It is very normal, yeah. And that's actually so the next developmental stage is like toddlers, 3 to 4 or 5 years old. And that's where you can start beginning to give them a basic understanding of privacy, like what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, different situations, things like that. You can start towards the end of that stage and into the beginning of the next stage. You can start teaching, like, if you want to masturbate or touch yourself, that's okay. Like, and see if you can get to a place where you can encourage it, because it's actually very healthy for children, even though most of us were probably taught that you should never do that. But that you do that on your own in private. Like, you don't do that on the living room couch with the family in the room, or, right? And just being really open and honest with that. You are absolutely, you may do that, but there's appropriate places to do it and appropriate places that we don't do it, right? And you can start teaching that already in the toddler years about, this is maybe a bit of a crass example, but we have words in our house, like, you can say this at home, but don't say this at school, right? Or things like that, where we talk a little bit about, like, what's appropriate in different scenarios, like you were saying.
Yeah, we have the same thing in our house.
Yeah.
We sort of say there's a bit of a cone of silence. Like, we give our kids, or we try to give them a lot of space to ask the questions that maybe they're not appropriate to ask their grandmothers.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. That's good. Yeah. And so in the toddler age stage, like 3 to 4 or 5 years old, it's really normal, again, for them to touch themselves, to start understanding that and wanting to do it more often because it feels nice. Playing doctor, or those kinds of things with siblings or friends, that's actually quite normal. There's absolutely a whole lot of resources out there about what's not normal, or when you should start be worried about certain sexual behaviors at different developmental stages. And if you are worried, I would encourage you to seek the advice of a professional. But for the most part, a lot of those things are just really normal. They're just curious, again, right, about their own bodies and other people's bodies. They begin to get curious about where babies come from. They begin to identify gender roles, establish their own sense of gender. This one is maybe a little bit tricky, but they start copying adult sexual behaviors. So, how are we modeling that kind of thing in our homes as well? And what are they seeing on television and things like that? And then how do we, create boundaries around that too? And again, in terms of the relationship piece, beginning to care more for others, especially when they see them in distress, and then also learning to kind of like themselves and understand that, hey, other people like me too. Yeah. School age, 5 to 8. This is where they can really start recognizing different stigmas and taboos around sexuality, especially if their parents are uncomfortable, and where they maybe start shutting down and asking questions. They begin to understand what sexual acts might be, depending on what they've heard or learned. And I don't think it's fair to assume that just because we haven't talked about it at home that they haven't learned about these things. I think it's another reason for encouraging and normalizing talking about this at every age, obviously developmentally appropriate. But is that if they're not getting their information from us as their parents, they're getting it somewhere else, and it likely isn't the information we want them to be getting.
Or it's just flat out wrong.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
even that it will be harmful. It's
No.
just that, kids will, and maybe I know several examples of people, their kid references what they think a sex act is. I was like, yeah, that's not it at all.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the encouragement to developmentally appropriate. So again, we'll maybe come back to this, but like these stages, they're well established
Yes.
in
And
the broader research. You
yeah.
can go online, you can find these breakdowns.
Absolutely. They're everywhere.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think that's a helpful reminder that I can, depending on the age of my children, I can think through what would be an appropriate way to sort of talk about this. And I mean, some of that is paying attention to what's emerging from their mouths or their
Yes.
imaginations
Yeah.
or from their bodies.
Yeah.
Just paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And so at this age too, like they'll begin to develop a self-concept of their own gender and their body image. They start looking for information about sex and sexuality. So again, if you're not offering it at home, they're going to find it somewhere else, or at least look for it somewhere else. They also start understanding cultural gender stereotypes at this age. Again, I just want to also, maybe because I didn't clarify this, like these are guidelines, right? Doesn't mean your child isn't maybe ahead or behind the curve. Like that's totally normal too. It's just these are general guidelines. This is when you can start talking towards the end of this, like in around 8 years old or so, you can start talking to children about puberty and changing bodies and getting them ready for that process. We already know that some children start puberty as young as 7 or 8. And so, again, making it normal, open, all that kind of stuff. You can start giving them education on gender identity, sexual orientation, again, depending on your sexual ethic and how that aligns with your values. And then, also things like personal rights and responsibilities in life in general, but also related to your sexuality. And one thing, actually, I forgot to mention, which I think is important, starting with the toddler years, really teaching children that their body belongs to them and teaching them body boundaries. And if you don't want somebody to touch you, you don't have to. So this is things like, and I know this can be controversial, but this is things like not forcing children to hug people, letting them make the decision, right? And if you have to, educating your parents as their grandparents that if my child doesn't want to give you a hug, don't force them, Again, depending on your sexual ethic and how your values fit into that. But really teaching children that they have autonomy over their own bodies is a really important thing. And also teaching the difference between wanted and unwanted touch and things like that. And that can start as early as like 3 and 4 years old. Yep. Maybe even younger. So, yeah. Preteens, 9 to 12-ish, this is the puberty years, fun, or the beginning of it. This is, again, they're going to start feeling conscious about their sexuality and how to express it. They're going to compare their bodies with other bodies. They might feel shy about asking questions about sexuality. They are likely to be influenced by media and their peers. They are probably likely to be masturbating and or having wet dreams and wondering if it's normal and okay. If we haven't had those conversations with them, they may develop crushes, but they're also learning empathy, sensitivity, friendship skills, how to accept responsibility in relationship and things like that, which are all important parts of our sexuality. And so at this stage too, like lots of helping them understand what's happening to their changing bodies, and not just the physical changes, but the emotional, social, hormonal, all of those things, right, is really important. Again, more information is always better. Well, maybe not always, but and then just maybe basic information about sexual activity, right? Like I think it's grade 5 where they do the sex education at school, talking about, partnering with teachers and things like that. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that I want the first time my kid to know what sex is to be in sex ed at school, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
I think that's I think it's an act of care. If you're here in Calgary, if your children are part of the public system, I don't know what it is like in charter schools or in private schools, but in the public system, you're going to know that your children are going to be taught this material because you basically, as a parent, you have to offer your consent,
I think it's the same.
which it should offer you some comfort, and it should also like help you if do the sexual ethic work, and then pay attention to when you get these notices in your your kid brings you a note and says this is what we're going to be talking about. There's an invitation there, to at least engage and step toward the conversation in that moment. If you haven't already, I think that's great.
Yeah. Or at the very least, prep it, or like say like, I know you're going to be talking about this and I really want to talk with you about it afterwards, right? That kind of thing too. Yeah. Did I go? I think we did most of that. Other thing with preteens is, again, and sometimes I think this is part of helping them develop their own sexual ethic, is helping them understand rights and responsibilities around friendships and relationships in general. Can be a good piece to that as well. 13 to 8, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that piece there, I think maybe we should take this to heart as parents. If you want to teach, because for me, in my own sexual ethic, consensuality is a big piece.
Yep.
I want my children to experience sex consensually. And I think it starts in this like broader training about relationships.
Absolutely.
Which to me is, I really appreciate that piece that you led with, that I think we have a tendency to reduce our human sexuality to our sex acts or our sexual curiosity, and we don't tend to sort of place it within a matrix of relational social fabric. And I mean, all that does is just gives us a limited imagination for our experience as humans, and then it probably doesn't mean that we'll focus on the right kinds of training for our children.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, teaching consensuality in sex is part of teaching like deliberate mutual relationships and friendships.
Absolutely.
Like the two are pretty closely together.
They are.
So
Absolutely, they are.
Strong reminder for me.
Yeah.
It's great.
And I think like coming back to, again, like teaching young kids body boundaries and things like that, that's all connected, because then they start, like, if they know that from the very beginning, then they know that they can say, no, I don't want to be touched that way, and they know that they have a right to say that, not that they have to just do what anybody else suggests or wants to do.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, the fun years, 13 to 18.
Let's do it.
Yeah, actually, they're my favorite. So, obviously, they understand themselves more specifically as sexual beings. They begin to understand options and consequences of sexual expression, which would include gender identity, intimacy, sexual orientation, all of those kinds of things. They may choose to express and explore their sexuality in ways that may or may not include actual sexual activity with other people. they might begin to understand different romantic relationship dynamics. This comes back to what you were just saying in terms of like some relationships might be more controlling, or there might be, these power dynamics and things that can be in, that seem to come into play even often in even more intense ways when there's a sexual element to the relationship. Probably going to have issues around body image, or at the very least be aware of it. They'll start to understand their own sexual orientation and develop a stronger gender identity. They may be, and again, this is part of the foundational work that you want to do as a parent, but they may be more comfortable seeking advice from you and other trusted adults, especially if you've done that foundational work and started from when they were very little, talking about these things in open ways and normalizing it. But they're also likely to seek information online. They're also likely to get a lot of different information about sex and sexuality from media. So this probably would connect back to some of what was talked about last week.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so one of the things we touched on briefly last week, if you look at the gender breakdown on media consumption and engagement, again, not all children land in one of the binaries, but the research on media consumption points to sort of female children tend to skew more to these social engagement applications, end up in body comparison, really dynamic environments where relationships are going to be talked about and characterized. I've seen this in my own children, sort of realizing that there's a sort of underlying sexual ethic being taught constantly when people are sort of talking about their significant others and talking about their encounters. Mm-hmm. So female children will encounter that way. Male children tend to skew more to applications that are built around gaming, so things like Twitch and then YouTube. And to think that there isn't underlying sexual ethic in the ways in which these kinds of social apparatuses are performed, you just need to just watch some gamers and listen to how many sexual references or innuendos are used, and paying attention as a parent. It's not all harmful, it's not all wrong,
no.
But just to realize that it's literally embedded in the media that our children engage in. And it's why it's helpful to at least know what is being said. Mm-hmm. I was going to say, a key for parents, it'll pop up for you. Your kids will use language, and you'll be like, wait, I haven't taught you that language. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Lots of the teaching moments in our house have been, and they're not all bad or harmful. I actually like those moments when you sort of catch this, like, do you know what this language, Mm-hmm. And it's actually deeply embarrassing when I know what it means and they don't. Anyways.
Yes.
So parenting tips and tricks.
Yeah. What occurred to me as you were saying that is like, it's deeply embedded in all the media that we consume as parents too. And I think a lot of us have become very desensitized to it, that we don't even necessarily notice how much sex is used to sell, or how much, all the different ways that sex and sexuality are portrayed in the media, and not just in like shows that you might watch, but like in commercials or in, right? And I was also thinking about when you were talking about, especially for girls, but I think this is true for boys as well, a lot of the messaging that they're kind of getting, and again, it's like, it's underneath the surface. It's not, nobody's blatantly saying this, but they're getting this message that, you can use your sexuality to get what you want. And there's power in it.
I think this is 100% true.
Yeah.
And this would be in the media side. Last week we were talking about teaching our kids boundaries, teaching them to be critical observers. I think older, so your kids are in this 13 to 18-year-old bracket. It's easy, I think, to have these kinds of conversations around, hey, we watch a film together. Like, did anybody notice how that's a vulnerable person? And they're using their sexuality, and they're interacting with another character. Does that strike you as maybe problematic? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of opportunity for when we co-watch and we co-engage to let our sexual ethic, as it's emerging or as we're thinking about it, like just talking it out with our kids. So
you're stealing my thunder here. That's my next section. It's all good.
How to talk? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Go
yes,
ahead.
that's part of it.
Any more with the teenagers, and then go to your.
No, I just wanted to jump.
Yeah,
sorry. I just wanted to also jump to young adults, because I think
great.
even although it's happening less and less, they might move out of the house at 19 or not. But they're still learning and developing, and they still rely on their parents, a lot of them, right, for information about things. But so this is where they're like maybe moving into more adult relationships with their parents, which again opens up a whole nother way of being able to talk about these kinds of things and provide guidance. Maybe helping them, I mean, ideally we're doing this throughout their lives, but helping them develop their own sexual ethic, right? And helping them go through those steps as well. They're completing their physical maturation during this stage, but I want to remind you, because I'm pretty sure Trina mentioned this in week 1, like the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until 25, which means they might not be always making the best choices around their sexuality, but, you know, again, providing a safe space for them to talk about that and how would you do that differently? Or using that as a way to remind them or to help them understand the importance of creating a sexual ethic, because that gives you a foundational, you know, kind of thing that so that you're not only making decisions in the moment, right? You know, they're more likely to be entering into more long-term sexual and emotional relationships and able to recognize that sexuality is connected to commitment. And maybe planning for the future, right? And starting to understand a little bit more of that, like, procreation side of it and how it, but also just, you know, maybe moving into more of an understanding that a healthy sexuality for them might look more like long-term commitment versus, yeah.
That's a really good point to pay attention to as your children are like late teens or young adults, that they, chances are it's going to be developing and you'll be able to identify. You may not always be comfortable with what you're seeing, but you are able to be a sort of an ally.
Yes.
And a presence. Because again, we live in a time where sexual expression and sexual practice they're informed by scientific innovation that means like family planning and pregnancy avoidance, or like this is a dynamic part about how many people experience and then live as sexual beings. And there are many people whose children may end up choosing to be in pleasurable sexual relationships that don't procreate. And that's, and to be truth be told, like this is in some cases what some cultures need.
Yeah.
They need fewer people to have as many
yeah.
children. And so that's an interesting sort of dynamic to live in, especially if you're a religious person, where religious communities have a tendency to normalize cisgendered heterosexual relationships that are procreative.
Yeah.
And we don't tend to identify anybody else's sexuality as moral
Yeah.
or as fruitful.
Yeah.
And so what a dynamic time to be alive, and what a dynamic thing to be in relationship with children who may choose to live beautiful sexual lives in ways that are different than we have.
Absolutely.
If you're a parent. Most of us are.
Yeah. And this is something I kind of forgot to mention with the teens, like starting and possibly even a little sooner, but really teaching, especially in those teenage years, how to be safe. You know, not just, you know, in terms of like not getting pregnant or getting someone pregnant, but also like in terms of STIs but also not just physical safety, but emotional safety, right? And really helping them understand what are the benefits, what are the risks of sexual intimacy, how do you know if you're ready, helping kids figure out if they are ready. And there's some pretty cool resources online for those kinds of things too.
What stage roughly? Like 13 to 18 probably?
Yeah,
it starts.
That's what I would say it starts,
Okay.
You know, that you start talking about how do you, if you choose to do this, how do you do it in a way that is safe? Yeah. And on many levels, right? Yeah. Because I know that's something that I was never taught, because you just don't have sex before you're married, so you don't need to know these things. Well, we all know how that's turned out for so many people, right? And not having access to birth control and things like that have, you know, altered the course of many people's lives in ways that maybe, I'm not necessarily saying it's all bad, but it wasn't necessarily, yeah. I'm conscious of the time, so.
I was just going to say, are you game to jump to?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to just pause, because Meg's going to talk us through, like, how do we talk to our kids about some of this stuff? Just as we come to the top of the hour, I want to make sure that we at least get some of those points in. But I want to invite you, if you've been watching and there's a sort of a question that pops for you, to throw that in the chat, and we'll try to answer one of those. And if no one throws a question in there, I've got a few.
Okay.
I've got one for sure
Okay.
that I want to come to. So
Okay. Perfect.
throw that in there. Meg's gonna walk us through how do we talk to our kids about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is important. I don't want to rush it too much, but you know, some of the things we've already touched on, and I think, you know, so like things like beginning sex education at birth, right? Using correct language. One of the things we can do is seek out age-appropriate resources as parents. There's so many great books out there, like books you can read with your children, books you can read on your own, or just even, you know, articles, all kinds of things. There's a couple of really great websites that I'll share on the resources page that have really great information about, not only about, you know, how to talk about sex and sexuality with your children, but, you know, how to encourage healthy sexuality and things like that. We already talked about dealing with your own stuff first. Trying to, I think I put on the slide that do it in a way that feels comfortable for you. And I should have added, but also accept that a lot of it's going to be uncomfortable. And maybe just be open and honest with your kids about that. You know, like I know that in some of my conversations with my kids, I've been like, I don't really know why this feels uncomfortable, but it does. And I'm just going to just throw that out there. And now let's just talk about it, right? Just being honest about that, because again, they're intuitive. They're going to figure it out anyways. Yeah. So, but also trying to find a way that feels comfortable for you. And I think what you were talking about, Scott, with things like watching TV together, like finding teachable moments, that's a really big one, I think, and that comes with doing things with our children. So watching TV and being like, okay, yeah, like you said, like, how did you feel about the way that person was treated or about the choices that person made? And just open up a conversation, right? Sorry, go ahead.
And just full disclosure, the older your kids are, they will not enjoy that opportunity. It's one of my favorite awkward moments. It's like, hey, I want to, like, I'll just give you an example from a specific film, from a Bond movie where there's a vulnerable person and the hero in the story has a sexual encounter with them. And I just remember being so troubled by this. And I haven't watched that film with my children, but I remember thinking to myself, if I'm sitting in this, you know, I'm watching this film with a 16-year-old that's my child, we should talk about, like, do you think that's okay?
Yeah.
Like, because it's just sort of passed off as that's just what happens. Vulnerable people end up having sex with people they don't want to have sex with. And we probably should talk about that.
We should talk about that.
Anyway, so just be ready yourself for, oh my goodness.
Oh, for sure.
Please.
Yeah. But the more you do it,
That's true.
the more you normalize it, they may not ever like it, but I think they'll come to appreciate it and respect it, right? And be thankful for the opportunity to have those open conversations. And so that's like things like, reading books together, watching TV. It can even be like listening to the radio and something comes on or whatever, you know, like you can point things out. And this can be at any age too, right? You know, I have an 8-year-old and she hears everything. And every once in a while she'll be like, what's that? All right, I guess we need to talk about this. And that's part of my thing too, is that like answer your children's questions. Don't avoid them. You know, keep the answers age appropriate, obviously. Or if you really don't know how to answer it, be honest about that and just say to your kids, you know what, that's a great question and I'm not really sure how to answer it. So let's come back to that. And then make sure you come back to it. Don't use it as a way to brush it off. Because I think if we answer our kids' questions honestly and candidly, in the moment as much as possible, they'll keep asking. If we shut those questions down, they'll stop asking and they'll look elsewhere like we talked about. So, and connected to that is like, try to use your normal voice when you're talking about this. You know, if you like get anxious or you're uncomfortable and you know your voice goes into this like weird squeaky register or something, like try to get your voice down to a normal thing. Like use a couple of those grounding exercises if you need to.
Just like, I don't know. That's good.
Yeah.
Maybe that's happened to you.
Yeah. Share your values with your children, obviously, and in all areas, obviously, but around sexual ethics as well. Start a conversation. maybe they don't want to do that. Oh, and then connected to that is learning together. And you had said that, like, sometimes, like, about with, like, they'll ask something and you know it, or they don't, but let's learn together. Let's learn these things together. You ask a question, I don't know. Let's figure it out.
In our house, I don't know how many times we've gone to Urban Dictionary.
There you go.
But more than once.
See, but how great.
I don't know if that's a true endorsement, but
how great that they feel comfortable enough to do that with you instead of with their friends and then maybe misread it or whatever, right? Obviously, keep a sense of humor. That's super important, right? And just be normal, just be natural. Make a joke if you need to. Cut the tension. And then the last thing is just repeat. This is something that, you don't have the talk and then you're done. This is something that I think maybe is different from the way a lot of us were taught, where it's like, okay, at a certain age, your parents sit you down, you have the talk, and that's the extent of your sexual education from your parents. Whereas this model is more about, we're going to start talking about it from the time you're really little to all the way till you maybe all the way, right? And we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to have different conversations and more conversations, and we're going to grow on previous things or build on previous things. Yeah.
So good. And Jen's agreeing. She just had said, thank you so much for hosting the conversation and for sharing. And thank you to you for all of the input and all of these helpful sort of observations. My favorite part is that nobody else has thrown a question in, so I get to ask mine. Yours. We're just going to do one. It's just after the hour, and I actually, so let's come full circle. And you started by sort of inviting us to frame a sexual ethic as parents, and I like that later you came later and said, like, encourage our children to write a sexual ethic. So it seems to me that I can't ask my kids to do that. My kids are all teenagers, so I can imagine that this will be something. It's like, especially with the older ones, it's like we should have that conversation. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a lot of fun, actually. Yeah. But I wanted to, because I don't know if I picked up, what do I include?
Yeah. Okay.
In a sexual ethic? Yeah. And I have some ideas. Yeah. Well, actually, why don't you share some of the things that you think, like, what question should be answered? Let's create a list that as a way to, like, how do I know I'm actually framing my sexual ethic?
There you go. Look, I have a quick list of questions right here. So there's asking things about, you can start with, what do I value in relationships?
Okay.
Remembering that sexual ethic is more than just the act of sex itself, right? What boundaries help me protect myself physically, emotionally, mentally? What thoughts and emotions come up for me when I think about sexuality, when I'm engaged in a sexual act? Some of that stuff we had talked about earlier. Okay. What about internal, external pressures I have around what a relationship should look like or what a sexual relationship should look like? Okay. Some of it is going to be around, like, what do I like? Yeah. What is important to me? And, like, again, Google, our friend, you can find all kinds of lists of things like what's okay for me sexually. Like, there's some pretty extensive lists online that you can find of, like, am I okay with this? Am I okay with this? And, you can go through those kinds of things in not that your sexual ethic needs to have a list of these things, but that in the creation of forming a sexual ethic, to understand, like, that will help you understand some of your boundaries as well, right? Yep. You mentioned consent earlier, right? Like, so is consent part of it? You want to, like, hopefully it is. There's also different frameworks online where I think there's, like, one called, like, the 4 C's of a sexual ethic, and there's things like care, covenant, not necessarily marriage, but just communication, and I'm not going to remember the 4th one. But you can, again, like, I'll take it. And you can use those kinds of frameworks as well for what to include in your sexual ethic. Also in terms of, like, is it important to me that I'm respecting the other person. You can ask questions as much as like, is it important to me that we both orgasm? Is it important to me that like maybe that's not important? Or, you can start getting into some of those details. Again, your sexual ethic doesn't need to be that detailed, but asking yourself these questions and trying to understand what's important to you helps you kind of figure out like, is it about pleasure? Is it about intimacy? Is it about both? I don't know. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I think you're, just sort of like nudging us, and then I think these are helpful considerations. I just found myself thinking, what questions do I need to be asking myself? And so things like being honest about my orientation,
Yes.
the kinds of things I'm attracted to.
Yes.
I also think for me, one of the questions is like, well, why be sexual? Why participate in sex acts?
Yes.
Like, what's the why?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big part
It's a huge part.
It's going to be a huge part of, especially because I think this is going to be a huge part of forming an ethic, because that answer to that question is going to change over time.
It is.
And it's informed by the matrix of relationships that I find myself in. What an amazing thing to think. And with who? With who? And then I mentioned this. I just like, when you start thinking about your sexual ethic, where does the Bible show up? Pay attention to that. Do a little bit of homework. If you're curious about this, we've talked through lots of the erotic and the sexual passages in Scripture, tried to be very clear about how the Scriptures are full of all these beautiful pictures, these very, very human pictures of sexuality, and that sometimes those images end up they're secondary to the sexual prescriptions,
right,
or the prescriptions of sexual ethic. Like, this is how it should, this is who gets to do it. And I think actually to be a parent and to then be open to my kids asking these kinds of questions means that my heart has to get even bigger. My imagination has to expand.
Yeah, because I think going on that too is like, part of your sexual ethic for yourself, obviously, is going to be about yourself, but also like, what am I okay with for other people's sexual ethics, especially my children? Yeah. And doing the work we need to do around that. Like, am I going to be okay with my child coming out? Am I going to be okay with my child, being sexually active at all? Absolutely. And if I'm not, why? And again, how does that inform my parenting and how I talk to my children about it? And there's a lot there.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. I feel like I haven't been sitting here this long.
No, I don't either.
It's been such a rich time. And I hope for some of you who are watching live, and those of you who will be tuning in and sort of tracking with this conversation in the days to come, hope there are even just the hints of some of how to move forward. Meg, so grateful.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
For your expertise and your honesty. And it's super fun. Meg's going to come back next week.
Yes.
And we're going to talk a little bit about how do we engage the practice of spiritually forming our kids. And you got some thoughts to kind of get that ball rolling. We may even refer back to some of what we've talked about tonight. But we wish you all the best for this week and hope to see you in 7 days. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody.